Many of you have heard of Counterculture coffee in the United States. One of the most highly respected specialty coffee brands in the world. They're respected for so many things, and value under every move is definitely one of them. That value is transparency. And Katie Carguilo is our next speaker. She's a coffee buyer at Counterculture Coffee. Katie is like family to me, and we're so happy to have her here in Seoul. And we're going to go ahead and bring her up. Katie, come on up. Big round of applause.
Great. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon. When they first asked me to speak today, there were a lot of different topics that I considered talking about. I've been in coffee for 16 years. I started as a barista, and then I was a coffee trainer. And for the past 4 years, I've been working in the coffee purchasing department at Counterculture Coffee, doing quality control and sourcing. And when I think big picture and look at where the coffee industry is right now, it's an interesting time for specialty coffee. There's a lot of consolidation that's happening, smaller to mid-sized companies that are being purchased by larger corporations and holding companies. Coffee supply chains are already starting to see the effects of this, and I think that we are going to see more changes soon in who sources the products for coffee roasting companies and how they do it. But Counterculture is in a unique position. We're still independently owned by our founder, Brett Smith, and we've been buying and roasting specialty coffee just over 1 million kilos a year for over 2 decades. And we have a reputation for being thought leaders in the industry for the balance of quality and sustainability in our sourcing focus. So today I want to talk to you about the history of the coffee purchasing department at Counterculture, about our approaches to coffee sourcing as different people have been the coffee buyers. What have been our guiding principles and what has changed over the years? So if we look at the beginnings of Counterculture, Fred Hauk was the first buyer for Counterculture Coffee. That's him on the left, and that's Brett Smith, the other founder, on the right side. Fred brought with him coffee experience. He was a coffee roaster for a different company before he founded Counterculture with Brett, and Brett brought business experience. Brett went to business school. And so at the beginning of Counterculture, Fred took on the position as the coffee buyer, while Brett took on the position of business development. Fred was a person that was really passionate about environmental sustainability, and he was also an active birder, or a person who liked to study the migration and habitats of birds. So this led him to focus on 2 things when purchasing coffee: organic and shade-grown coffees, so that it was coffee that was good for birds. Counterculture was also the first certified organic roaster in North Carolina in 2002. So Fred had really strong principles. He believed in certifications, but he wasn't a relationship builder. He never visited the people that produced the coffee that he bought, not that it was really customary to do that in 1995. This is an example of a product that Counterculture carried during Fred's time at Counterculture, the Sanctuary line with coffee carrying the Smithsonian bird-friendly seal. And I never got to meet Fred. He passed away before I started at Counterculture. So after Fred, in 2000, came Peter Giuliano. And Peter's time as green coffee buyer for Counterculture coincided with the farm-to-table movement in the U.S. food scene, excuse me. That movement was focused on knowing where your food comes from, with the implication that great tasting food experiences start with great ingredients. And so all of the best restaurants at that time talked a lot about the farms that they directly sourced their food from. And so like that movement, Peter, in his role as coffee buyer, focused on where and from who he purchased coffee from. Under Peter, Counterculture really started promoting single origin coffees, or coffees sold with the name of the farmer or the cooperative that produced them, as opposed to just a country or a blend name. Basically, what this meant was that Peter also celebrated seasonality in coffee, just like restaurants would celebrate seasonality in their produce. So we made our coffee menu seasonal. So instead of having coffee from Honduras on our menu 12 months out of the year, for example, we would just sell it for 6 months after it arrived, and we would switch having different single origin coffees on the menu according to what was in season. Peter is best remembered for his gift for telling stories. Every coffee that Peter bought had a story of the people and the places behind it in connection to the coffee flavor. And in order to do this, traveling and making connections was a big part of his coffee department, something that Fred hadn't really done before him. He searched to buy the best quality coffees, and he paid higher prices for higher quality coffees. Because the majority of coffee farming was still a risky and at times unprofitable business, this approach seemed to be a solution. So this is a slide that Counterculture came out with a comic back in 2011 called What's the Deal with the C Market? And this was a time where the C market hit historic highs. I think at 1 month it was at $2.90 for C prices. And now Colleen's talking about we're in a time where it's hovering around $1. So a lot of people in the coffee industry, in the specialty coffee industry, were questioning, what does this mean for our business? And what Peter was saying here is that this could be a really great thing, because if we paying around the same prices that people have to pay for commercial coffee, if we are able to get people used to better tasting coffee, then perhaps they'll never be able to go back in the moment when the C market goes back down. And that's sort of the spirit that Peter brought to his work, and the vision that he had and what he hoped would pass for great tasting coffee. So this approach of roasters traveling to meet producers and negotiating higher prices for specific lots of coffee, it was framed as a new way of trading. And the term that these roasters came up with to describe it was direct trade. The problem was, unlike a certification that has shared standards and a definition, the companies using the term direct trade came up with their own definitions for what direct trade meant to them. Counterculture also made up its own definition, but like a certification, we had an outside company verify that our coffees that we sold as direct trade fulfilled the requirements of the definition that we came up with. So ours was the only direct trade certification on the market that was independently verified, meaning it wasn't direct trade just because we said it was direct trade because it met certain qualifications. Another approach that made Peter different from the other buyers of his time was this practice. He would say, if you buy the micro lot, you have to buy the main lot. He wanted Counterculture to have the best coffees, but he recognized that buying a small lot for a higher price wasn't going to make an entire farm sustainable. So being a good business partner meant buying more coffees across all quality levels. And this approach remains an important part of our buying philosophy today. So this is a photo of, right here, it's basically 3 coffees from Honduras, from a farm, Finca El Puente. On the left, you see those micro lots. They are single variety lots from small plots that they have planted with different coffee varieties. In the middle, and that might go, what we might pay in FOB would probably be around 5 times as much as the middle coffee. The middle coffee is their single origin selection, very good, 86, solid, great tasting coffee. And the coffee on the right is a blend called Big Trouble. And we might buy the coffee from Finca El Puente to put into the blend for, let's say, 50 cents to $1, maybe less than the single origin coffee. And so we buy different quality levels at different prices from almost all of our producers, the producers that we work with. Peter was a romantic about coffee. The attitude of Peter's coffee department was, can you believe that there's a coffee like this from this place, and aren't we so lucky to be able to be drinking it? I met Peter in 2004 when he was becoming a coffee superstar and I was a barista. And I was totally enthralled with his approach to coffee, with the idea that what we were serving people was better and fancier, and it was improving the lives of producers. So in 2013, Peter left to join the SCA, and previous to that, the coffee department had grown to 3. Kim-Elena Ionescu and Tim Hill worked under Peter and then became the sustainability and quality managers, respectively. So Kim came into Peter's department, she built on his vision, she questioned it, and she ultimately made it better. Where Peter wanted to tell the story of coffee producers, Kim wanted to give a clear picture of the context behind why and how coffee came to be planted in a certain place. A good example of this is Counterculture's Origin Field Lab. Starting around 2005, every year Counterculture takes a group of baristas down to a coffee-producing country to experience production firsthand. You know, touring coffee farms, picking coffee, helping in the processing. When Kim took over this trip, she added some workshops, like the overview of how coffee supply chains work. She placed that Origin Lab in Nicaragua and started telling people about Nicaragua's political history and why that made the cooperatives there so much stronger than in any other Latin American country. Kim spearheaded the Transparency Report, which started in 2008. Counterculture was the first roasting company to publish such a report, which included a list of FOB prices paid for our coffees. The first report only included the direct trade coffees, which is about 8 coffees on our menu at the time, but it has now evolved into a complete map of FOB prices that we pay for all of our coffees, over 300 lots that we use in all of our products. Kim also helped create the Seeds program, which is a fund for sustainability projects at Origin. The way that it works is that Counterculture saves 1 penny off of every pound of coffee that we sell into this fund, and then twice a year producers can apply for grants. This became a way not only for us to financially support some sustainability projects at Origin, but also for these efforts to be conceived of and driven by producers themselves. And this is a picture of coffee farmers in Burundi that are working on their project of building an organic compost system. More than anyone, Kim was willing to ask hard questions about what we were doing as a company with the idea that it would make us better in the long run. Perhaps the most obvious example of this was through a case study that she co-authored entitled The Social Impact of Microlots, which examined the microlot approach to sourcing that is central to direct trade. Kim fully recognized that our requirement that producers produce high-quality coffee often requires that they make significant upfront investments that sometimes are not going to actually pay off for them. And that our model of financially rewarding some individuals more than others might actually undermine the social cohesion of producer organizations. These are important questions that are still worth asking. What are the costs of imposing our values on others? Kim also terminated our direct trade certification in 2014. She recognized the term had no official meaning in the market, and it was creating a false dichotomy that some of our coffee purchases were more sustainable than others. So instead, we made the move to 100% transparency, reporting FOB prices for all the coffees that we buy, not just the best direct trade ones. I met Kim when I was a barista on one of those field trips to Nicaragua. That's actually me in the red bandana in the picture on the left. She represented to me a new paradigm of coffee buyers. Coffee buying wasn't just for artistic types that had great taste in food. Coffee buyers like Kim are fluent in Spanish and asking questions no one else is asking. Coffee buyers are young women. In 2014, she became the SCA's Director of Sustainability. And having worked alongside Peter and Kim as Counterculture's quality manager, Tim took over full reins of the coffee department after her departure. So more than anything, Tim Hill is a person that is really passionate about coffee quality, but also about potential. He saw his role as coffee buyer as an identifier of quality, yes, but also a developer of quality. His philosophy could be summed up as Counterculture doesn't just find great coffees, we work with producers to make great coffee happen. Tim's obsession with quality also led him to the tendency to think that any existing tool wasn't good enough. So under Tim, Counterculture updated the Coffee Taster's flavor wheel and designed our own cupping form. Tim wanted to identify the best processing practice practices and help our producers implement it with a specific focus on preserving quality from origin to roastery. He shifted our purchasing volume 50% away from Brazil with its lower cost, lower quality conventional coffees to places that were able to produce the quality and environmental sustainability that we preached, like Ethiopia. He relentlessly sought to understand coffee, not satisfied with the idea that coffees that come from Ethiopia taste the way they do because the varieties they grow there are heirloom or passed down generation to generation. Tim embarked on a years-long project to identify and catalog Ethiopian coffee varieties, which led him to publish a book, A Reference Guide to Ethiopian Coffee Varieties. Another idea Tim brought to fruition was to hire coffee department staff outside of the United States. He hired Getu Bekele to work for us in Ethiopia. Getu's there on the left. And Getu, a plant breeder and researcher, co-authored the varieties book with Tim. And the person on the right is a consultant, a coffee farmer, that works with us in our coffee supply chains in Kenya. But perhaps the most lingering impact that Tim's vision will have on the coffee department was his creative solutions to problems no one else was considering. The best example of this is the use of color sorting technology in our roasted coffee. Counterculture is the first roaster in the United States, maybe in the world, to use color sorters on roasted coffee. We use these color sorters to sort out Quakers. Quakers are defects that exist in all coffee. They're beans with less carbohydrates and sugar, so they don't turn as brown in the roaster. Instead, they remain yellow. And the impact that they have on flavor is that they make coffees taste less sweet and more sort of popcorny. Tim had the idea that since sorting out a Quaker isn't 100% achievable at origin, and since climate change is making this problem worse, a great way to improve the quality of our coffee is to use this technology at the roasting level. Because we donate 1% to 3% of the coffees by weight that we sort, that is in this picture here, you can see that's unsorted coffee on the left, sorted coffee in the middle, and then what we're sorting out is on the right. Because we donate 1% to 3% of all the coffees that we roast, we're literally throwing money away, but we're doing so to improve quality. The way that many specialty roasters operate, in order to improve the quality of their product, the pressure is put on farmers. It's put on farmers to improve their processing practices or to plant different varieties. And by using a color sorter, Counterculture is owning the idea that a coffee roaster has a responsibility and a role to play in improving quality. Tim, to me, is one of the most relentless pursuers of coffee quality that I've ever met, and that energy is really inspiring to be around. I knew him as a coffee buyer at Counterculture before he became my boss and mentor. And 3 months ago, he left to take a job with Atlantic Specialty and Ecom. So now with Tim gone, what are the rest of us thinking about now? I'm gonna pause and drink some water and let you guys think about what maybe we're considering. A big thing on my mind is making specialty coffee work for everyone. Counterculture's been in this business for 23 years. We aren't necessarily making more profit off of each pound of coffee that we sell now than we did 23 years ago, but we're doing okay, and our volume has certainly grown. But smallholder farmers, as you have heard other people talk about on this stage today, they by and large are not doing better, despite specialty coffee's better business practices. So I think we need to learn more about two things. We need to understand what's happening in coffee supply chains generally, as well as what's happening in counterculture supply chains specifically. And then we can draw conclusions about what business practices work and what don't. So to that end, we're evolving our understanding of prices in our coffee supply chains. We've come a long way since we published that first transparency report of direct trade coffees, but we've realized that talking about FOB prices is not communicating the full picture. Understanding the FOB price for what you see on the screen here, AA quality coffee from Colombia, it doesn't tell us what farmers are being paid for their products or if that price is enough. So we're asking a lot more questions about farm gate prices and we're trying to come up with creative ways to influence those. We're also working to empower producers. I want producers to understand how to leverage the various supply chains available to them, to understand what the quality of their coffee is and what a sustainable price is for their coffee. So they can approach buyers with this information as opposed to buyers approaching farmers with C-market prices as the basis for negotiation. This year, Counterculture is going to fund a few projects. In Kenya, we're going to help build a cupping lab for farmers to host buyers that want to purchase coffees direct and outside of the auction. And in Ethiopia, we're helping a group of farmers set up their own office with internet access to help them communicate with potential buyers. Internet access and cupping labs, these are things that you or I would think of as necessary if we wanted to start a coffee farm and sell our coffee. But they aren't the norm for the vast majority of producers in the world. So now that I've talked to you about all of the coffee buyers at Counterculture over the past 23 years, what do I think the takeaways are? The most obvious takeaway is that it's okay to change what you're doing. Each buyer at Counterculture kept some parts of their predecessor's approach, but they changed others. Fred kept Peter's passion for environmental sustainability, but increased the focus on stories. Kim kept Peter's approach to long-term partnerships, but was more transparent about the sustainability of the business. And Tim kept Peter and Kim's focus on people, but also made an equally important focus on quality. Making changes doesn't mean you're compromising your values. When you sharpen a tool, you have to get rid of old material in order to get at what is best and most effective about that tool. Acknowledging that we were wrong about direct trade, that was difficult, but it wasn't accomplishing what we set out to do, so it was necessary. Another thing is that I think it's okay and necessary to evolve your definitions of quality and sustainability, particularly sustainability. Someone once said to me, the answer to what is the most sustainable product depends on what area of sustainability you're focused on. Creating an industry that works for everyone is a much bigger problem than one coffee company can solve. We have to work together, and we have to dig deeper to really understand the impact that our business decisions are having. Finally, I hope that I have made the case for transparency. All of us in coffee still have so much to learn. We need to be sharing information about what we know and asking each other questions about what we don't in order to move forward as an industry. Industries and companies, for better or for worse, they grow in what they're rooted in. Each of the people in Counterculture's coffee department have influenced the direction in which their colleagues have grown. But we've been able to influence an entire industry, I think, because of our transparency throughout the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. You want to sit down? You want to have some more water?
Hello? Okay.
Great. That was so great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so many takeaways that you summarized so well at the end. I guess my first question is, let's not so much question, but let's talk about this a little bit. That you talked about change. Mm-hmm. So you talked about the way that Counterculture, in terms of green purchasing and the people involved and the work and how the approach to the work has changed, and it was really interesting. There's another facet to that, which of course is the changing industry.
Yeah, and
as
the changing world.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because part of it with a company like Counterculture, whereas for a lot of us in the industry, most people in the industry, the change happens responding and reacting and trying to follow the new trends. Mm-hmm. But, part of what makes Counterculture so important in the coffee industry is the ways that Counterculture will help set the trend, and so talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that each of the people that were working in the coffee department had different aspects of the approach that they were frustrated with. I think that Peter really was a good storyteller and synthesizer, and that worked for a really long time because it enabled us to sell more single origin coffees through telling those stories, to pay higher prices. But what happened was that the buyers that worked underneath him then traveled to Origin, and then still were interacting with coffee farmers that were saying, these prices aren't sustainable. And then that's a confusing experience because as the buyer, you're thinking, well, what my boss told me was that we pay $1 more than the market, so how could this not be sustainable? So Kim's reaction to that situation was, well, let's dig in deeper and let's try and figure out how we can influence people to also pay prices like this by publishing FOB, to fund sustainability projects at Origin, to figure out whether or not our business practices are doing more harm than good. And then with Tim, I think Tim was dealing with the fact that he was very much a quality-focused person, and a lot of the coffees that he felt like we were selling were under-delivering on their promise of deliciousness for one reason or another, be it, storage or shipping. And so he was really focused on, codifying what quality meant. And now with us, we are looking at this coffee picture and thinking there's just more transparency sort of than ever, but there's also more misunderstanding about the differences between specialty coffee and commodity coffee, and just whether or not the coffee industry is going to be sustainable in the long term because of problems like climate change. And so I think that right now, at least what's on our mind is what's the response to that, But yes, I think that part of it is influenced by the reaction that people have from our day-to-day interaction with the product and the people that we work with, and then also just the conversation in the world around us.
And what you're describing, what's really interesting is, and there's an interesting sort of trend here, because with Peter and to some degree with Tim, there was a lot of trying to explore new territory, whereas what you described with Kim, and to some degree what you're talking about you want to do, is really about, not so much exploring into new areas, but bringing the rest of it to where it's supposed to be.
Right.
Right. That's really interesting. So,
which some people are more excited about one thing than others from a marketing standpoint too. So that's a big question.
Right.
Is, what works. One of the things that Tim always told me was that, well, not necessarily Tim, but just marketing departments will say, the only thing that sells is quality. That's really the only differentiator. Anything else that you tell people about impact or doing a good thing or being more, equitable towards producers than others, that at the end of the day doesn't sell. And I don't know if I completely believe that. I feel like we're at a moment right now where that can be challenged. Yeah.
You talked obviously about Brett and Fred Houck at the very beginning, but I think if we can speak bluntly, at that time, Counterculture was a great coffee roaster, but was not kind of known in the specialty coffee sort of community until Peter came in. Peter has a distinction. He likes to talk about, Peter's my friend, your friend, and very out there giving a lot of talks in the coffee industry. And he likes to talk about how he started as a barista.
Right.
Tim and Kim didn't. You did.
Correct, yes.
And that's really, that's an interesting kind of coming full circle there. In here in Korea, the sort of high-end specialty call it trend or the sector is still kind of relatively new, as it is everywhere, but you still feels very new here. And therefore, there aren't people necessarily 20, 30 years in the business. And so a lot of people who are baristas, they don't necessarily see a path to coffee buyer kind of position. But tell us about having started as a barista, and then, of course, as an educator, as a trainer for Counterculture, and now being a buyer, like how much that barista experience it's relevant to your work and how you look at coffee.
Yeah. One of the coolest things that I've ever gotten to do at Origin was I have competed in barista competitions since I started as a barista.
You were U.S. Barista Championship.
Yes, that's
champion.
Yeah. In 2012, United States Barista Champion.
Yep.
Started competing, I think, in 2005.
That was the only time I cried in public in a coffee event. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I went down to visit with coffee farmers, and there was a small, like, regional coffee forum happening. And they asked me to give a demonstration of a barista competition. They brought in and plumbed in an espresso machine and asked me, like, what ingredients do you need to make your signature beverage? And I said yes. And even though I was a little bit nervous about it and didn't know, like, who I was going to be making coffee for, but I just ended up making a lot of espresso cappuccinos, talking about the competition. And a lot of the questions that farmers had were about, what types of coffees win this competition? And how do baristas pick their coffees? And is there particular varieties that do well? What are the judges looking for? And so it was really fun because I totally expected that not to really have much to do with my job, but I realized that there were baristas in the audience, there were coffee farmers in the audience, and that I had a bigger perspective on the coffee industry than maybe another person could bring to that. And I had a bigger microphone because I literally had a microphone with 150 people watching me put on this show de Barismo. So it's things like that that I think are really interesting. And I really think that more people with different backgrounds can potentially bring a lot to coffee buying, just in terms of how they can communicate. If they are a native Spanish speaker, they have can speak Portuguese, and they become coffee buyers. They can potentially have deeper connections and ask better questions and gain better information to bring back from the supply chains for us all to learn from.
And in terms of your own barista experience, like, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Because, of course, when you're a barista, you start out just brewing coffee, thousands and thousands of coffees, and in your case, for many years. And then, of course, doing the training and things like that. And you encounter other coffee buyers out there. But in what ways does that sort of, having that so much experience kind of making the coffee, do you see an advantage to that out there when you're doing your work compared to maybe people who don't have that kind of experience? Or even like dealing with customers and consumers, things like that.
I do think that the messaging to consumers probably is better or at least different, talking about potentially ways that these coffees can be brewed or utilized. I don't know if, I do have conversations with people at farms about coffee brewing, but I don't know if it doesn't influence like the way that we make our purchasing decisions.
Mm-hmm. We talked about how the industry changes and how each of the 4 generations you talked about adapted and changed to meet those new conditions. Mm-hmm. I know, because I know you, that you've been looking into some of these kind of new technologies that are out there and exploring a little bit about how mm-hmm. they might relate to the coffee, green coffee trade. For instance, things like blockchain, which is a big buzzword, especially here in Korea, a really hot topic. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about what you've learned and maybe, what you think could be the future there. Yeah,
well, I think a big thing with coffee prices is that we really need to start understanding prices beyond FOB. I mean, I do think that knowing the FOB price for a coffee should be a baseline. I mean, we shouldn't be purchasing coffees in an untransparent system. So if the people that are selling you coffee are not willing to talk about the FOB price, and then from there you can extrapolate, what their margin is and explain to you why it is that they have the margin that they have, which could be for very legitimate reasons like storage, like transportation. But that really is, I think, should be a precursor for specialty coffee purchases. But really, we need to dig beyond that and understand what producers are getting for their coffees. And that's where I see with the blockchain technology, there's a potential for it to be utilized, tracing down to essentially what blockchain can do is it creates a digital ledger of payments. So if your payments are happening through a bank, that can all be put onto a blockchain. But if your payments are happening in cash, that can't necessarily be traced by a blockchain. It would have to be manually inputted, which is not any better really than the system that we have now. So it's not really, you can create that supply chain you can create a blockchain supply chain in that instance, but you're gonna have to pay for that technology. And I'm thinking I would rather pay producers if they could just supply me with that information, then pay a tech company just so that I can tell consumers, oh, this is blockchain. Because again, if it's not doing what it's set out for me to do, which is make transparency really easy to access and get producers higher farm gate prices, then it is not interesting and not worth it to me. I do think that there is potential. There are some coffee supply chains where producers are paid mobily, as opposed to being paid in cash, and perhaps blockchain could be inserted there, and that might be potentially interesting. And again, as you said, the one thing that I can't ignore is the fact that blockchain is very interesting to consumers. And so if there's a way to do it, in a way that I feel like satisfies the transparency and ease of use concerns that I have, then I would like to do it. It sounds cool to be a coffee company using blockchain technology.
And from everything we know about counterculture, I think counterculture is uniquely positioned. If it seems like a good tool,
right.
you all are pretty much guaranteed to be the first to be, because the transparency has been such a major part of counterculture's buying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's potential, but it's not quite there yet in my mind.
Right. Katie decided, because she knows. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
to
for
everybody.
having me.
Katie Carguilo.